Okay, so hopefully you're here for the web development seminar by me. It's sponsored by Chap Research. For anybody that's new to the school, Chap Research is the innovation program within Westlake that I founded like a year or two ago. And so each person is more or less required to teach about the skills they learn as part of Chap Research. And so this is one of those. This is the first one open to all of Westlake, in that I was able to teach enough people. Okay, so a couple things before we start. I'm going to be going over a lot of content, so don't panic, it'll be fine. We're going just a little bit into each of those, so I'll send out resources and stuff like that if you want to go more in depth with anything. But just be aware that this is not all there is to web development. This is just to get you started, get you comfortable, possibly get you a job. It's a lot of content. Okay, also that being said, definitely do not be afraid to ask questions. It'll be fine, no one will make fun of you. I'll throw this at you if they do. Okay, I have some note outlines that actually I need one of my minions to pass out. But, so they're not really full of notes, I just have little cheat sheets. So it's, you're supposed to call my subject. So this is just so that you know, kind of, you can keep some of the terms and stuff straight. You don't have to fill out everything on here. There's extra space if there's other stuff you want to put on for whatever reason. But I'll just give them out as we need them. And that's just something you can check there. If anybody needs pencils, I brought a bunch of them. I also have notes, or sorry, like notebook paper if you want to take notes. Over here, Rach. Oh God, I didn't think everybody would need pencils. It was in the, oh yeah, you were. Anybody else need
Parker, it's not making fun of you.
Anybody need notes paper or anything like that?
I'd just like to see.
Give me two of those. I just want to see what I'll
Okay,
get my
guys,
way.
notebook paper or anything like that? There's space on the sheet to write, unless you like line paper. Okay. Here, yeah.
Look at
Okay.
that. Walk a good style.
Pencil too, guys? Do you need a pencil?
Yeah, right.
Even if I'm.
Alright.
So weird.
So you have all that stuff to take notes, and that's important just because we're going to have sections where you have to work on it by yourself. And so we want you to refer back to your notes before anything else, and so you can just figure it out on your own without asking too many questions. So you'll want to keep track of that. Also, hopefully these are useful skills which you might want to use later, and so you can keep these forever, hanging on the wall or something. That being said, you don't have to write down every single word that comes out of my mouth. The video that we're taking, unfortunately, will be online as well as this whole PowerPoint. I already mentioned just keep the laptop that's closed so I know you're paying attention. And then if you're answering questions, raise your hand because there's a lot of us. I'm not about giving trick questions, so just be aware of that. Warning you in advance. And then also help each other during the do-it-yourself portions. Okay, so since we're doing web development, we'll start with the web and the internet. So that being said, what is the internet? Does someone want to try to tell me before we start? No? Yeah, like,
It's a giant collection of servers that communicate with each other.
do you read my PowerPoint? Okay. Yeah, so that's right. That being said, it's not the World Wide Web. That www dot actually refers to the network of all of the websites, because that's distinct from all the other things that computers connected together can do, which we'll get into a little bit. But those websites are stored on servers, which is why the World Wide Web is really closely linked to the internet and why a lot of people get it wrong. And then servers are any computers that quote unquote serve, because someone was being created. So they just run specialized software in order to show you web pages or do other cool stuff like email clients or email servers. And then the whole web is connected through hyperlinks, so it's just linking from one website to another, and then normally you navigate it through a search engine. And then a little more on servers. like I just said, provide service. But the other half of that equation is the client. And so a client is anything that's accessing those services. So that's a computer, your phone, whatever it may be. And that's running web browser, email software, all sorts of other stuff that I don't want to list now because it's scary. And so that just accesses information from the server. Is everybody good? I know I talk fast. Okay. So first of your acronyms. Once you make a connection, you type something called the URL into the address bar. Anybody know what the URL stands for? It might help you remember, but if you happen to know it, I will be impressed. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, but if you're one of the people I've already taught this so that you can help me teach it later, give it like 15 seconds of awkward silence, and then you're allowed to answer and show off.
Does the L stand for link?
No.
Used to be universal.
You want me to answer?
Universal. Sure.
Uniform resource, look there.
Yay.
Ooh, yeah.
Okay. So
This is so tiny box.
yeah, I tried. Okay, you guys, you don't have to use the sheet if you don't want to. It's only if the acronym will actually help you remember what it means. In most cases, they're pretty straightforward. This is
And there's
something.
no points deducted if you go outside the box.
Yes, think outside the box, guys, and believe me. So it's called the Uniform Resource Locator because it's used to locate resources. These are all pretty straightforward. That's how you access the locator. That being said, URLs are actually just, yeah.
I think I missed the other acronym.
Do you have a different one that I give you
You
like?
gave me the HTML one.
Oh, hello.
Thank you, Isaac.
Nice to see you're paying attention.
Okay.
You can like hold on to it. I trust you with that one for now.
Great.
Okay. Hey, that's not a worksheet for you, Isaac. Okay. Anyway, so the URL is something that's human friendly, so it's a word that you can remember like Chap Research, whereas that's not actually what the computer is taking in because they prefer numbers. And so the link between those things is, sorry, I forgot to guess on that one, is the DNS records, so that's a domain name service. A domain name is just chapresearch.com, for example. And so it's linking chapresearch.com to what's called an IP address. Anybody know what IP stands for? Sure.
Internet protocol.
Yeah. So this is the IP address of Chap Research, and so it's a bunch of numbers that link directly, that point to our server, basically. You could technically type this in, hit enter, and it would take you to our server, but hopefully you don't have that memorized. And so that's why you use chapresearch.com.
Did you say this was online?
Yes, the PowerPoint. Are you going to memorize it? Okay, so that's that. So,
Hey, Rachel, one quick note. Guys, go back if you would. About memorizing.
I know, here come the quick notes.
Yeah.
They'll happen throughout, I'm sorry about that.
About memorizing, that IP address can change. And it has, actually. It's changed once in history for chapresearch.com. And that's the whole point of URLs, is that you have names as opposed to numbers, and then the numbers can magically change and you just don't care. So don't memorize that. Because we'll change it just to make it hard on you.
Why would it change?
It changes actually for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that people have really small servers and they get really popular, so now they have to get a bigger server, so they go to a different company that hosts their servers for them. Then they need a different IP address.
Anytime you move it to a different machine, it's going to have a different IP. So
And actually sometimes, like one of my favorite URLs, they are so popular that so many people come to it, you have to have multiple IP addresses just to service it all. That's mit.edu, that is really popular.
believe me, Google has a whole building of them.
Anyway, commercials aside, once you've actually connected, what is it you actually get? So all the information is stored in packets, and so I'm just going to go through the structure of a packet. I shamelessly stole this off of like house.words.com, so it'll be fine. So when you're setting a packet, you want to know where it's going, where it's coming from, stuff like that, and so that all goes into the header. You also want to know which one it is, so you can put it all in order, because the machine on the other side has to reassemble everything into a cohesive web page. And then there's what's called the payload, which has all the data it's containing. And we'll talk about what kind of data that can have. But then finally, there's this little bit at the end that just says that's the end of the packet. There's something called a checksum to show that everything's good. I can explain that if you guys really care. But okay, so this is the packet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That did not sound encouraging. If you have any questions?
No.
Okay. I'll just quiz you later, it'll be fine. So some of the things the packet can contain is what's called HTML. And this is what it stands for, because I just wanted to think that way sometimes. But it's what's called a markup language. So some people consider it a programming language, but it's really not. A markup language is something that just sort of shows what the contents of the website should look like. So it's really for formatting and for putting text and stuff like that. It's not actually compiled or processed or scripted or anything really programming. And so that HTML is then sent to the client. And so the client will have software like a browser, Mozilla, Chrome, whatever else. And that's what actually displays it for you on your web page. And a web page can either be static or dynamic. In this case, if it's just straight up HTML, it's static. So it's just a page of HTML. It's going to have the same text all the time. We can talk about what it means to be dynamic. But it's basically just that the server is running some sort of language, or it's generating the HTML on the fly based on some sort of input, however you want to do that. Also, we will teach you HTML. It's super easy to write. Lots of people learn it in my high school. So. All right, you want this one, Ben? What is TCP/IP? Anybody happen to know what it stands for?
I only know the details.
I know the last part, Internet Protocol.
Good job. All right. So transmission control protocol, internet protocol, you don't have to have that memorized. The idea is just that these are two really important protocols to the way the internet works. And so that's for, I think TCP is how it takes things and separates them into packets and how it puts it back together, and then IP is how they're transmitted. But no one really cares exactly which is which. You just have to be able to throw around the acronym if you know what you're doing. Everybody good with that?
Yes.
Okay. And then that's all really important because the packets go all over the place. So again, they're containers of information. They've got all that there. But this is a picture from Sprint, I believe. And so the internet is actually, like we were talking about, a whole connection of random servers that are actually just commercial companies. It's not one person that owns the internet, and that's kind of the beauty of it. But they all have to agree to follow these protocols for anything to work. Because the packets can take any sort of route to get to their destination. And so that's how, so it'll avoid some area that's congested, stuff like that, so that it gets there as fast as possible. And then also, since it can go any route to your destination, it doesn't matter if one or two servers are down somewhere. So the moral of the story is it's amazing that it works at all, and you should be proud of your internet. And then one more thing about the packet structure, I actually lied to you earlier. I edited the earlier picture because you weren't ready for it yet, but you are now. There's also something called the protocol or the port number, and that's because, that's Chap Research.com by the way, that's because the server has multiple ports in order to access the different services it has. And so for example, you see here, chapresearch.com, and then you do :80, and so that's how you access a particular port on the server, and so it'll give you a certain protocol back. And so port, protocol, and service are all sort of the same thing, and so that's how it knows to use certain service. And so that service happens to be HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and if you remember what hypertext is, that's just any text with links in it, and so this is just a fancy way of saying it's handing you HTML if you give it :80. And that's also the default of your browser. So if you type in :80 and hit enter, it's going to do exactly the same thing it did before. It's very exciting. But that's just displaying your page by giving HTML. Does that make sense? Another interesting one, I forgot about Apache. Apache is the service, or the software that's listening on port 80, and that's actually what's giving you the HTML in most cases. And we'll talk about what that is in a second. Another possible service you can get is email. And so it'll be called something like send mail, and it's listening on port 25. Obviously, that's not something you type into your, yeah.
So when I type in the port number on the end, is it actually going to like a different location on the physical server? Or is this virtualized somewhere?
Well, we run a virtual server, which I'll talk about, but in this case, it defaults to 80 when you go in the browser anyway, and so it's kind of irrelevant. But if you, we'll go into it a little bit on PuTTY and stuff like that, you actually have more of an option with it. And email is generally something you won't talk to directly, but it becomes important when your Gmail service, whatever that is going to port 25 for you. So a lot of times email is something that a computer is interacting with, and so you're actually talking to port 80 to the web page or whatever to interact with it, which is then talking to port 25 via for email on your behalf. Does that make sense?
Can I try this one, Rachel?
Go
Okay.
ahead.
You know I do this, right? So Ben, on your physical server or whatever, every program is listening for data. They're listening for network traffic. And whenever something comes into the IP address, the machine knows which programs are listening, but it subdivides them by what port they're listening on. So the email program will come up and say, hey, anything coming in on 25, give that to me. And the operating system's like, cool. And same thing with your browser. It comes up and it says, hey, anything coming in on port 80, give that to me. And whenever it comes in, it hands it to it. That's the idea.
All right, everybody good?
And those are more important to website administrators, network administrators, things like that. They know those, like they know their own name. They know what ports are doing what.
Yeah. And just sort of to add on to that, a lot of this stuff is not directly applicable. I mean, you can really go in and just blindly generate HTML and follow some online guide or something, but we're really trying to give you kind of a background knowledge and appreciation for what's going on in case you ever want to go deeper or just understand what's running your code and why it's relevant. So you're welcome. I'm sorry to say you're welcome. So Apache, like I was saying, is the amazing open source free web service software that runs on a whole lot of websites. It kind of fluctuates around half, but that's just what's listening on port 80 and returning HTML like we were talking about. That's actually what we run on our server, and I might be able to show it to you at some point. Everybody good with that? I think we might be getting to the drawing portion. But so when you go to chapresearch.com, what it's pointing to is our Linux VPS, and we will talk about that. Okay, I apologize at this point. Coach Eric decided I should practice drawing on a whiteboard in front of a bunch of people. So I have to draw on the whiteboard for you guys. And the slides actually have the explanations, but hopefully I can do this. Okay, so I don't even know what VPS stands for.
Virtual private server.
Yeah. Maybe someone will answer questions now. Okay, so if everybody can see this, hopefully, a server is generally, you guys see a little from over there?
Yeah, it's not drawing very dark.
Try the other one, I'm sorry.
As I said, did you get that one from the shop?
No, I got these from home, because I didn't think any,
You know the ones in the shop usually are.
is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
Drive by searching.
Okay, so servers are,
Nice rectangle.
servers are generally just, they don't look exactly like computers in that there's not a user interface for them generally. So it's just some rectangular prism somewhere. But the difference, the reason that ours is virtual is because this computer could be running any number of private servers for various people. So the company that does ours, myhosting.com, has a whole bunch of these boxes in some facility somewhere. And so our virtual private server could be running on any number of those. So virtual just means that they're splitting the work, and it's not that our server corresponds to one physical machine. So for example, this could be us, and then there's some other guy with this little portion. And so they give you that based on how much you need, based on the memory and the processing, how many people you think are going to be coming to your website, stuff like that. And they're more than willing to give you more than one physical machine and just try to do a whole lot more. So that is the VPS. Does anybody know what Linux is?
An operating system.
Good job. Okay, so it's free open source operating system. Operating systems are just like Windows, Linux, the Mac OS. And so that's just the very general software that's running on your computer. And so the difference kind of about Linux is that it's often used for development because it's really customizable. And it's also a really small and kind of low profile operating system. And that's important for servers because it can also be used without a GUI, graphical user interface. And so the reason for that is because on a server, you don't want to have other software running things like your pretty screen, your 3D renderings, or anything like that, because the server just has to be as fast as possible and really good at what it's supposed to be doing. And so Linux allows you to kind of get rid of everything else.
Can you repeat what GUI stands for?
Graphical user interface. And another thing about it being a server, the OS for servers generally, is that there are a lot of servers that run Linux. And so you can call it the predominant internet-facing OS, in that it's the operating system that talks to a whole lot of other computers to do stuff with the internet. That being said, it can also be used for humans. I think there are a couple people that have Linux just running on their laptop. You can use it with a graphical user interface, but the beauty is that it can also be used for this sort of thing. Does that make sense to everybody? So Linux is just sort of the outside container for what we're doing here. And then one final thing is that Linux can be any sort of what's called distribution. I like calling them filters, but it doesn't really matter. Ubuntu, Mint, and Debian are some of the most popular. Each has its own religious following. They're very, very similar, but we can argue about that. Yeah, they'll argue about which one's better.
I'll
based
tell you
on-
my favorite distribution if I want.
Exactly. Okay, thank you, Mike. So, that being said, how is it you communicate with something that doesn't have a graphical user interface? If any of you are familiar with the Windows command line, this is an example of a program that will take commands, whatever it is you're typing in, and it passes it to the operating system. And it basically is just this magic box that lets you communicate with the server. So, okay. I'm sorry. Okay, this is you, and this is your keyboard. You've got the command line. In Windows it's command, but I'm lazy, so we're just going to do CMD. Which is why I didn't want to draw. Okay,
You'll get better.
and so you just type whatever it is you want into here, and then through some magic we'll talk about in a moment, it will be transferred over to the server, and then it'll actually execute your commands on our virtual private server. And so that connection we do through what's called a virtual terminal. And so it's virtual. Lewis asked me this, and so I had to look at the answer. It's virtual because back in the really, really old days, a physical terminal, was this. So it meant you had, I made the picture black and white, that wasn't actually that old, but it's a standalone box that you use for communicating with the server. And so you had to have this whole separate thing sitting on your desk because computers were too big to have in your room. So it's virtual now because it's just a window on your screen. And you guys all downloaded PuTTY. That's what that terminal, it's called a terminal emulator. And so it's a really tiny program, it's quick and easy. And that's the magic of modern science.
So Rachel, you heard Mrs. McMahon laughing here. That's because her and I used this in college.
Yeah, that's why
It's
I had to
really,
mention
really
it.
old.
Yes.
Okay, so
Paper tape.
I also mentioned that it's a way of interacting with the shell, which then brings up what is the shell. And so, broadly speaking, a shell is just an interface to start other programs. But in this case, it's allowing you to talk to the command line. And so in Linux, it's actually just called the command line shell because they're all sort of combined together. Terminal, command line, and shell can all get kind of confusing. Some people blindly use them interchangeably, so don't be worried if it gets mixed up.
There are also different kinds of shells depending on what operating system.
Yeah, a lot of operating systems have adopted these things. This is command line shell. And so what PuTTY is actually doing, so this is PuTTY here. We will go over PuTTY and you'll actually be using it, but that's how you spell it for whatever silly reason.
What does PuTTY stand for?
Doesn't stand for anything, and it's really, really frustrating.
There's a lot of acronyms in the computer and high tech
Yeah, I
that
guess
don't
they just-
stand for anything.
I don't know. I couldn't put it on the sheet because it doesn't stand for anything, and it's very sad. Okay, and so the way it actually communicates over here is through what's called SSH. Anybody have to know what it stands for? Given that there's an SH in shell, maybe. No?
Something shell.
Good job.
Server shell?
Standard shell.
Secure shell.
Oh.
The worst part is it's actually a lie. It's not a shell, it's actually a protocol. And so it's just, sorry, on behalf of all of history, they were lying to you. It's actually just a way of talking to the server, and so you just kind of agree that this is how you're going to send information, and that's how you're able to communicate. And so, just to review again, we have Apache sitting in here in its little box, listening on port 80, and then there's also some process or program or service, whatever you want to call it, that's listening for the SSH protocol that we're sending, and just interpreting what we're doing in the command line shell, and then it's being executed on the server. And that's port 22. If you're curious. That will become important in a moment. Anybody have any questions? I feel like you guys are terrified of me. Yes.
Okay, so from what I understand, when you send in your commands from the command line prompt or whatever virtually, it's sent through SSH or to SSH?
Sort of both. If you're,
Okay.
it's just a protocol for talking
Mhm.
back and forth, but when you're actually using it, like in the English language, it can be a verb. You'd say, I'm going to SSH into the server.
Mhm.
That's just how I use it. But what's actually happening is it's just an established protocol for how you're going to talk back and forth.
I'm gonna shut in the server.
And just go with SSH. You can try that, but you'll probably get laughed
Good
at.
job.
Alright, so is everybody else good? Okay, so that being said, we're going to start playing with PuTTY a little bit, not silly PuTTY. It's downloaded on all of your computers, right? Okay, so we'll talk about it first, and then you guys will get to play with it yourself. So, PuTTY is awesome. It's blocked at our school, which is how you know it's awesome. And it's free, it's open source, and it's awesome. It does a lot of stuff we're not actually going to get into. And like I said, it's a terminal emulator for talking to the server. In this case, we're using SSH. This is what it looked like. Maybe you opened it. Yes?
What is a terminal emulator?
It's also called a virtual terminal. We talked about it a second. It's a little web. Oh god, this is going to be too much effort.
You don't have to go back.
I just want to prove that I mentioned it. Here it is.
Okay.
Maybe the picture will jog something, because it's a great picture.
Okay.
Anyway. So this is what it looks like.